Welcome to part 3, objective 3. In this objective we're going to explain the operation of multinational corporations and understand the moral criticisms made against them. So we're building on our coverage, I suppose, in the previous two parts when we were mainly looking at the overview of the global business environment, but talked a bit about multinational corporations as well and their relationship to government. Now we're going to focus more strongly at a more visceral level. There's a good word, visceral. A more visceral level at multinational corporations and their relationship with government, issues of culture and corruption, cultural relativism, how they deal with legislation, some issues related to child labour and sweatshops, and human rights, and then we're going to move on eventually to talk about MNCs and moral responsibility. So, here goes. Many MNCs have a great deal of economic power. We established that in our discussion of our first objective. They may have more economic power than the host countries in which they operate. They ultimately have the power to leave the country by withdrawing from that country. They can close their operations in that country if it's not an important market, if it doesn't have the right resources, if it doesn't remain an attractive host nation in which they want to operate. So that gives them economic power, and particularly in developing countries, but in all countries, there is competition for investment. We're seeing that just at the moment with Virgin Airlines. Now, Virgin has gone broke. Well, gone broke. They're in liquidation. They're in voluntary administration. When Virgin first started, the Queensland government, 20 years ago, gave them a tax holiday, gave them low-cost locations, gave them a preferential deal to operate out of Brisbane Airport and other airports in Queensland. They supported them because they wanted to attract an airline that would service and support Brisbane's or Queensland's tourism industry. So they really wanted to be able to, and to reduce the pressure, they had to rely just purely on Qantas to do that. So they gave them all these incentives. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is as they went broke, the government in Queensland offered $200 million to keep them afloat. That didn't come to fruition. The New South Wales government is bidding with $400 million tied to them, Virgin moving its operational head office into New South Wales. The Victorian government is having discussions reportedly with Avalon Airport and the transportation magnate that owns Avalon Airport to enable that to become the central hub of Virgin. So they're all competing to attract, and between states within one country, to attract this company. We see the same thing globally. We see countries competing through incentives, through provisions of tax holidays, creating of free trade agreements, providing particular things all in the educational environment, in the finance environment, in the legislative environment, to try to attract and retain investment to enable their countries to be developed, to maintain employment. So all these things give MNCs some power. Now, the size of the multinational corporation gives them the most power. There was actually an agreement for Amazon to establish its second hub in the Bronx. It decided that it would not do this at the last moment, its second head office, because of opposition by particular politicians, including Ocasio-Cortez, to the business practices of Amazon and the impact it might have on businesses in New York, even though it would bring in industry and employment. The quality of the employment wasn't seen as great. So I disagree with this, but that competing argument meant that in the end they decided they wouldn't establish their second head office in New York. Now, whether that was the only reason, I doubt it. I think there would probably be other reasons as well. But they were able to tailor that to further improve their negotiating power in the other states they were negotiating to establish head offices that they were willing to withdraw if there wasn't a positive environment in which they could see to operate. We've seen the complete withdrawal of manufacturing of cars within Australia by the Holden, which is General Motors, Ford and Toyota when subsidies declined. And now we're just seeing the complete withdrawal of General Motors from Australia as a retail operation. Now, General Motors has a global strategy to stop making right-hand drive cars, and they've been withdrawing from those other markets as well, but not all of them. There's still some incentives for them to operate in some markets to enable them to service those markets. MNCs look for ways to reduce their costs by sourcing finance, by sourcing labour, by sourcing materials, by trying to change the taxation system, by trying to change the operation systems within the legislative requirements, the safety requirements within the countries in which they are operating in. It's called The Race to the Bottom, and in fact, the video that we are going to show, which is your tutorial activity, which is on the Bangladesh shipbreaking industry, and we're going to have a little mini debate on that in next week's tutorial, is about a country that is so desperate for employment, Bangladesh, that it has in fact got this whole shipbreaking industry, the dirtiest, most dangerous, most low-paid industry in the world, arguably, as a major part of its economy because of the way its legislation and enforcement works. And I want to be really clear that this is not just confined to this lobbying, this attempts to influence the nature of the home country's environment, and the host country's environment is not limited to developing nations, it's also developed nations. 2 elections ago in Australia, the Labor government was proposing a royalty on super profits for mining exactly the same as the royalty on super profits that already existed for petroleum and gas, to get better return on investment on the royalties of the minerals being mined by multinational and domestic companies in Australia. The lobbying focus, the attempt and to influence the outcome of the election was enormous. And that continued into the most recent election as well. Australia has always been the top one or two in the world on the sovereign risk rank, which means it has the lowest or second lowest sovereign risk in the world. Sovereign risk is the risk of companies losing control of their assets because of government action. It was characterised throughout 2 elections ago and then throughout the last, and to a lesser extent since then, as being, by the mining industry, as this change to tax super profits on companies that basically were paying hardly anything in royalties, were receiving giant subsidies on their railway networks and other tax haven subsidies, and were paying low royalties on super profits they were making as a risk, a sovereign risk that would stop investment in Australia. It wasn't, but that's how it was perceived, and that probably influenced the election. MNCs want to produce their products in the areas that have the lowest labour and materials costs, the most cost-efficient areas. They want to locate their research and development and their higher activities in areas where there are the best universities, the best research centres. They want to sell their products to the most lucrative marketplaces with the least number of restrictions. They want to invest in a country and control their proprietary technology. While countries want almost the opposite of that. They want tax income. They want better jobs. They want their entire workforce or their entire society to benefit from the upskilling that's provided by the multinational corporation, so it flows out so that they can create better jobs across the board, not just within that type or within the single company that is, or the single company network that is being used. So the benefits, I'm not saying there are no benefits of multinational corporation investment. Clearly there are. There's capital, there's technology, there's expertise, there's skills and knowledge. But there is a disadvantage that they're not in a position of power. The MNCs tend to be, and the power can be abused and misused, and that can sometimes lead to a race to the bottom. Second areas of think about is corruption and cultural relativism. Now we know there are cultural differences in the way business in different countries. We know there are ethical differences and what is ethical. We know that there are differences between the ethical values in the host country and the ethical values in the home country. Which ethical set of values should the MNC adopt? And then overlaying that, there's often legislation that requires particular level of compliance with the home country, the multinational company's home country legislation when they're operating in host countries, and that can be things about child labour, about corruption. In Australia, if you want to get a land title quickly, to facilitate building a building or building a road or building a motorway or whatever, there's a standard fee that you pay to the government department that expedites the provision of that document. Now in Australia we have a fairly clear and transparent land title system without too many overlaps of land titles, and the land titles tend to be quite big, and the liens, the areas controlled by other companies like electricity and gas and the council, or areas which must be kept clear because you've got to put a drain on it or it has a telecommunications line going through it, are all relatively clear. Not perfect, but relatively clear. Now, in, say, Thailand, where land holdings are quite small, when there's often competing ownership of particular plots of land, particularly between different government departments who claim to own the same part of the land, where there are lots of tiny land holdings. If you're subsuming that land to build a building or a motorway, you need to get many small land titles to be able to demonstrate that you have and pay compensation for those to build your motorway. There's no way to do that quickly. There's no expedited process within the government. What there is a concept of T-money when you're paying minor bribes, about 200 baht, to get your document at the top of the list. Allegedly. So that's a small aspect of corruption, not a large aspect, not grand corruption. But we also know that there's grand corruption both in developing and developed countries. There's crony capitalism, and one of the examples we're providing is this Rachel Maddow piece, this video from the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC that looks at Trump's relationship with one of the buildings he's building or was building immediately prior to his election. So that's a very interesting discussion of corruption and relativism. Some countries require that you comply with home country laws when you're operating in other countries. So there are corruption and bribery laws that operate from Australian companies that say Australian companies must behave in a particular way overseas, or you can be charged back in Australia. Some countries don't have that. Which ethical position should you adopt? Cultural relativism argues that morality differs in different cultures, and it's not right for a visitor or a guest in that country to impose their own values on the host. So such arguments lead you to taking a neutral position. And some companies, particular companies, will argue that they should just comply with whatever the local law is. Going back to our shareholder view or our limited stakeholder view of ethics and corporate social responsibility. Some will argue that no, we are bound by this universal higher level set of moral codes, whether or not they have consequences. Many countries in which MNCs operate have no standards regarding things like, or limited standards regarding working conditions, wages, and minimum working age. And even those that are part of agreements, and we're going to show you a video when we're talking about that on Bolivia in a couple of weeks when we're talking about labour conditions, even when they are part of multinational agreements, and they or there is legislation requiring minimum wages and working conditions, there is a difference between having the legislation and the quality of the enforcement of that legislation. Does that only apply to developed countries? Of course not. We see the issue of wages theft, and one of my reasons for picking wages theft as your as your case study is because it applies in Australia as it does in other countries, and how that legislation and how that process is enforced and protected. Some countries, because of the lack of legislation, means there's little restriction on sweatshops and child labour. MNCs may set guidelines when awarding contracts, but the guidelines may or may not be enforced. They may be merely moral smoke screens designed to make it look like a multinational corporation is complying with a code of conduct, but in reality, its contractors are not. Harmful products that maybe have strict guidelines of their use in US or Australia or the UK regarding product safety, regarding protective gear while manufacturing those products. Where those guidelines don't exist, unsafe products are often dumped by companies wishing to reduce their losses or to continue to make profit from a dangerous or toxic good, and inherently safe products may be rendered harmful in local and foreign markets, in host country markets, because of the way they're marketed, or the lack of safety equipment, or a range of other reasons about that mean their use in one country may be safe, but in another country may not. Now there are balancing and competing situations related to harmful products. DDT causes WHO says DDT is a known cause of cancer. DDT was taken off the market in developed countries and taken off the market globally. Malaria is the single largest cause of death in developing countries, particularly in Africa. DDT was the most efficient and effective way to kill mosquitoes. It also had a most efficient and effective way to kill other bugs that were affecting non-pest resistant crops. So, yes, less cancer in Western countries and possibly less cancer in developing countries, particularly in Africa, but higher risk of malaria, which is the biggest single killer in Africa. So there's a two-way street within this moral benefit. A relativism. There are different attitudes which MNCs need to be aware of, and in some cases MNCs just ignore human rights abuses that relate to these areas: racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, safe working conditions, fair wages, union representation, political disenfranchisement. All those human rights are in some way documented in the UNHCR and in the UN. However, not all countries sign up for all of these human rights in the treaties and related to these rights. Should an MNC behave in the way of its host country or in the way of its home country? Is there a universal set of human rights, or do they vary by country to country based on legislation? is mere legislative compliance enough? There is an argument that MNCs are expected to behave as good corporate citizens in developing countries. One of the things that forces to an extent that they do this is the consumer backlash when they have transgressed, when they have failed to behave in a safe way. We see that normally tied to events, a factory fire that kills people, evidence of child labour, rather than it. And then firms can adopt a code of conduct, and we've talked before, and we'll talk later in this course again about how codes of conduct have limitations. And there have been calls for a global social responsibility regime in which corporations need to comply with that global corporate social responsibility regime. Corporations are also expected to behave as good corporate citizens in developed country, but even in developed countries, there are plenty of areas where there's little or no legislation or political will to enforce good behaviour in developing countries, and corporations are under no legal obligation to pursue corporate responsibility issues unless there's legislation within the host country, the home country, of the country they come from. Unless, of course, we have that consumer pressure I mentioned before. MNCs are increasingly under scrutiny from boycott groups, consumer groups, when they transgress accepted moral norms in developed countries, but we quickly forget. The United Nations has a global compact on corporate social responsibility. There's a current negotiation round on table on the principles for business in corporate social responsibility in banking and finance. There is a membership organisation that has members of banks as members of that organisation, trying to reflect corporate social responsibility. But again, it's a code of conduct, and how strongly that code of conduct is actually complied with is demonstrated through a standardised system, and whether the companies, Westpac, for example, was part of that code of conduct, and they've just been caught for money laundering or having a system that may facilitate money laundering, allegedly. We have measures of corporate global corporate responsibility published by Transparency International, which talks about the corporate social responsibility both in terms of corruption in particular countries, but also has a measure of corporations' responsibility. The Straits Times publishes a list of ethically behaving companies within the ranking. There's a whole range of sources that rank the ethical behaviour of companies that can be used to pressurise them to behave in a particular way. There's a convention on combating bribery of foreign officials that the OECD, all countries in the OECD have signed up. And there's a range of other pressure and treaties, but whether or not they have the ability to influence moral behaviour and ethical and corporate social responsibility, but responsible behaviour, also depends on the management within the organisation. There are rules, there are attainments, there are goals, but as we know, corporations and managers in corporations may agree with them or may just find ways to use loopholes to get around them. Which brings us to Objective 4. What are the legal and moral responsibilities of multinational corporations? I believe that the multinational corporations need to be aware of cultural differences, not impose their cultural perceptions on other countries, but still need to meet minimum levels of human rights, particularly in relation to things like discrimination, racial profiling, providing a living wage. I believe that they have obligations for climate change, obligations to avoid environmental damage. I believe those obligations extend more than just what their legal obligations may be in a particular country. They have obligations to their local community to ensure they're safe, that they're not living in a polluted environment, that they have a living wage. They have obligations to their local employees, and they do have obligations for repatriation of past wrongs. But the dilemmas they face are, in a competitive environment, are they justified in paying a host worker less in the host country than the rate he would get in the multinational corporation? And is the country morally obliged to follow safety guidelines in their home country when the standards of the host country are lower? These two dilemmas are the dilemmas that we're going to deal with the Bangladesh case, the Bangladesh shipbreaking case, in the tutorial, in the second part of the tutorial. Okay, so this is basically all I got for the lecture. This is Objective 3 and 4 put into one part. Note that there are several videos that illustrate the issues that I've raised, that support the issues that I've raised. One that you can now watch that explain and support the issues across this integrated group of lecturettes that I've given. So, flicking back right to the beginning of what we've covered, we've talked about the nature and history of globalization. We've explored the moral issues relevant to globalization and its impact on power distribution around the world. Then we spent time talking about the moral criticisms and the operation of MNCs and the legal and moral responsibilities of MNCs. I'll see you at the tutorial this week. I'll see you at the tutorial next week, which is the tutorial related to this week's topic, moral issues in international business and globalization. Stay safe.